I figure out. Okay, so this meeting is being recorded. Welcome again to everyone. We're really excited to be here today with our guest speaker, Sandra Pertek from the University of Birmingham and Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. And I keep the introduction short. So Sandra is going to speak about faith, gender, the protection of women and girls in humanitarian and forced displacement contexts. So that's going to be her presentation. We have Romina Istratii here from SOAS in London, who will then provide a response. And yeah, as I said, it would be great if you are happy with that, if you just introduce yourself in the chat, say a few words about who you are, if you have any institutional affiliations, why you're here. As I said, my name is Jennifer. I work with the JLI, and I'll be leading you through the next hour. So without further ado, Sandra, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the introductions, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm extremely honored to be with you and delighted to see many of you today. And first of all, thanks to GLI for hosting this launch of this guidance note, and to Romina Istratii for kindly agreeing to respond to this launch. So today, as you probably know, I will talk about a guidance note that I have developed on faith-sensitive protection from violence against women and girls, using an integrated intersectional and socio-ecological approach that I have been working on for the last 6 years. I'm grateful to University of Birmingham and Queen Margaret University for their invested interest in this area. And I thank ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, for postdoctoral funding that enabled me to focus on this piece, among other important things that I've been doing. So without further ado, here is just a little bit of a context of this guidance note. We all know we live in quite unprecedented times of increasing forced migration. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by violence. We know that. And while there are many factors that shape this vulnerability and exposure to violence, intersectional approach became very popular, but religion remains an overlooked category. So even though this is an important risk and protective factor, intersectional theories often overlook religion as a meaningful category, and that's why I focus on this category in my work. And as the humanitarian crises are unfolding, there is this mismatch between the needs and resources that are allocated to the plight of women in displacement and humanitarian settings. So definitely we need new, innovative responses to violence against women and girls. And that's why this guidance note is being proposed to develop some of those new approaches. Well, before I move on, I should give you a little bit of a background to myself, so you understand where I come from. So in terms of my past, I've been working as a humanitarian practitioner, specifically gender policy advisor. And then I went on an academic pathway to develop this study on gender-based violence and influences of religion in forced displacement. So over the years, I saw in my humanitarian hat, I've seen a little interest and attention into religious factors in humanitarian sector, especially around violence against women. And religion has been often seen as a good blame, perhaps, for some forms of violence. So I went to studying the intersection of gender-based violence and religion during my PhD, and in my postdoc, as I thought, and I thought that in addition to all this writing and all this policy and advocacy work that I've been invested in, I should develop something practical. So during my postdoctoral fellowship, I have, determined myself to develop something practical. So after developing several papers and policy and books, book chapters and a book even, I have decided to write this guidance note that I'll be talking to you about today. And well, there was one event of this nature already organized in 2021 with GBV area of responsibility. We had an event on the role of spirituality in responses to violence against women in humanitarian settings. Okay, these are the questions that are guiding me. So I was thinking after my PhD, what can I make to support healing and prevent violence? And then in my postdoctoral fellowship, I went to this thing on how can I strengthen protection of displaced people globally. And I thought by working with religion would be the good way of moving forward. Okay, so next, just trying to move slides that are not really helpful. Okay, here. So here, this some academic outputs that underpin this practical note. Well, it's a product of 5 years of work, which is presented in much condensed manner in the guidance note. These are some of the papers that I invite you to read in your own time if you are interested in this subject. Now, what's the guidance note about? What for and why? Why did I want to develop it? Well, the answer is very well captured by one of the key informants from Lebanon that I interviewed during my PhD study. And she said something really useful. She said, you cannot work on the topic of gender-based violence without taking religion into account. The role of religion for SGBV was so complicated that it's never only religion. It's a vehicle to maintain a specific order in families and societies. Religion has so many functions. So I think that's a very great summary. Simply, you cannot work on the topic of gender-based violence without taking religion into account as a cross-cutting factor. And another key reason, so well expressed by another key informant, is what I will read now out to you. You can read it in your time too. Religion is always mentioned as something to be overcome. It's definitely not seen as something that could actually give women options or give women hope or the ability to even get out of that situation or to find ways of coping. There is even sort of almost a prejudice within the international humanitarian development system, seeing religion, culture, tradition is all negative. So yeah, religion has been by many practitioners included in my studies, but also from many discussions and observations that I have held in the sector over the years. We know that often religion is seen as something negative rather than a resource. And this resonated with my journey as I observed faith insensitivity in humanitarian sector. So that's why I thought the guidance is really needed to see religion in a balanced light. So looking at religion as a risk and resilience factor, a protective factor. So this note aims to improve response to violence against women and girls and make humanitarian system more inclusive. And all this by advancing intersectional and socio-ecological approaches. I will explain that in a bit what it means. In terms of the aims of this note, very quickly, I'll just measure time. I know I shouldn't talk forever, but I will try to contain this all within 15 minutes. The aim of this note is to help humanitarian practitioners to navigate through religious complexities in gender-based violence programming, help practitioners to adhere to humanitarian principles by respecting religious freedoms and their religious needs, and to improve programming by taking socio-religious factors into account. Well, I hope this note will help service providers to better support survivors by recognizing their worldview. And this material that I developed with many colleagues, this is not just my own work, there's many people who contributed to this work, and lots of inspiration and lots of readings and literature produced out there by many academics and practitioners. I hope that condensely I provide some resources to mitigate the negative impacts of faith insensitivity on survivors and of gender-based violence programming, because some of the programs and interventions, obviously, that are faith insensitive can create some risks. And I hope by engaging with this guidance note, we can mitigate some of these risks by insensitive program design. Okay, so briefly on the methods before I go into the content. I won't bore you. It's just a very quick overview, but you can read it in your own time if you like. So briefly, multi-methods underpin this guidance note, starting from literature review, interviews with displaced women in Turkey and Tunisia, interviews with humanitarian practitioners in Turkey and Tunisia, and international and staff from international organizations who are based in different regions. These were online interviews. Then focus group discussions that I held again last year in Turkey with a Syrian woman in Ankara, and some discussions with Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And then 2 multi-stakeholder online consultations that I held last year, maybe some of you attended them, and 1 international workshop at the University of Birmingham last year, and several bilateral debriefing sessions with different protection specialists from international organizations in different locations. Okay, so then in terms of what is meant by religion, you may wonder, I use religious resources framework by Terhar. So Terhar has defined religion as religious ideas, religious resources she defined as ideas, practice, experience, and organization, which in practice can mean access to material support, social connections, emotional support, infrastructure, information, and services. So in brief, religion does have practical counterparts. It's not only all about these transcendent notions and religious practices, but there is a real life application of religion. Obviously, people have just access to all these different things that religious networks enable, and religious connections or religious identities and affiliations that can help people to access all different services and goods, items, and so on. Anyway, moving on. Now it's time to finally introduce the guidance note. There are 2 parts of this note. One is on preparing for faith-sensitive violence against women and girls prevention and response, and the other part is on delivering faith-sensitive prevention and response of violence against women and girls. So I won't go into very much detail of them, but I will outline key principles and the overarching messages of this note and invite you to read them in detail. Perhaps some of my colleagues could put it in the chat box, the link to the document itself. I can do it afterwards, but it's on GLI website as well, so maybe my colleagues from GLI could put it there. So as you probably read it in the invitation to this event, the underlying approach that I have been using in developing this note and in my studies is called integrated intersectional and socio-ecological framework. So I'm integrating intersectional lens and ecological, which I call socio-ecological, looking at the social factors, to identify risk and protective factors at the same time. This integrated framework enables a better understanding of the intersecting causes of violence and risk factors that are often associated with social identities of people and the resilience capacities. It helps to identify resilience capacities as well of survivors and affected communities, such as those that relate to religion, but not only religion. In my view and studies, that the findings that come out is always an intersecting factor. Religion never comes on its own. Okay, so in terms of integrated framework, this basically enables us to identify how to reduce vulnerabilities and risk factors and how to strengthen resilience and protective factors at the 3 interlinked socio-ecological levels. So here I explore, okay, micro, meso, macro. So starting from micro, personal characteristics and beliefs, interpersonal family factors. At meso level, looking at situational, extended family and community factors, and at macro, looking at the contextual, societal, and structural factors. Okay, if you are interested in this framework, there are other papers to read. Now moving on to the note itself. So why do we need a guidance note again on religion? Well, we need the guidance note because religious, cultural, and spiritual influences influence violence against women and girls in following ways. You might have already come across this in other events, studies, your own work, but basically religion shapes survivors' help-seeking behaviors, perpetrators' behaviors, mental health outcomes of survivors. Religion shapes also people's needs, such as ritual, for example, the need to ritual purification, all the spiritual needs that emerge, and then religion shapes use of and access to healthcare services. For example, sex segregation norms may hinder access to male doctors for women. Religion also shapes use of medication and treatment plans. For example, while periods of religious fasting may influence decisions about medicine uptake, and also religion influences use of alternative traditional medicine and healing practices that may determine the help-seeking behaviors of survivors and perpetrators. and many, many more things. But we need to move on to now, acknowledging before I go on to not essentialize religion. Okay, so here I wanted to highlight that there are other factors that affect survivors' vulnerability to violence against women and girls. Well, that affect women to vulnerability, affect women's vulnerability to violence. That's what I meant to say. It could be all the different factors that humanitarian settings and displacement situations exacerbate. So starting from people's insecure immigration status and language barriers, experience of discrimination in different services, lack of trust and relationship building between survivors and protection professionals, and economic costs of attending appointments of service providers, such as transport costs and childcare, and so on. So we need to be aware, obviously, that there are many other factors that shape survivors' experiences of violence. Anyway, moving on. Here is the structure of the guidance note. So I'm looking at specific recommendations at different levels of socioecology for working with different groups of people. Okay, so at individual level, I look at how can we support survivors. At family level, how we can work with families. At community level, I'm looking into how to engage with women's faith organizations and groups, how we can support women's peer support groups, how to work with those groups, how to engage with informal women leaders, how to engage with men and boys from faith communities, and how to engage with formal faith leaders, male and female, and finally with faith institutions. And there are many different recommendations and suggestions and several case studies. One of them is coming from Project DLD that maybe Dr. Romina will tell us more about. It is an excellent example of how to mobilize religious leaders to respond to domestic violence based on the case study in Ethiopia. Well, we don't have time to go into these details now, but I invite you to explore in your own time the specific recommendations for working with different groups and different case studies included there in the note. And now we have time to go for general suggestions for working with faith actors. So I will go through some general suggestions and recommendations for practitioners that are perhaps key. And if you are interested to work with specific actors or groups that I've mentioned, I do invite you very kindly to look into the guidance note itself. Okay, well, in terms of the general suggestions for working with religious actors, first of all is to engage them across the project cycle, from assessment, design, and implementation to evaluation and monitoring, directly or through established initiatives with local expertise and networks. And then to train faith actors on psychological first aid to enable them to be able to support survivors as any other actor that is trained on psychological first aid. Why faith actors would be excluded from this? And then general suggestion is to sensitize faith actors on increased risks of violence against women and girls in forced migration settings, to inform adequate prevention efforts, for example, including of trafficking and exploitation due to restricted mobility, food insecurity, homelessness, lack of legal status, language barriers. All these areas could be involving faith actors to sensitize them on the issues that women or men who are displaced face, so they could respond and support people affected by crisis to overcome those challenges, either of trafficking or food insecurity across different humanitarian areas. Right. Now, briefly, in terms of key recommendations for the practitioners that I would like you to hear about, here are perhaps 8 that I would like to highlight. The first 2 are about the impact of religion on survivors, perpetrators, and service providers. I think we could all reflect that religion has impacts us in some way to either develop certain subconscious biases or certain beliefs about other groups. So it's just not being for practitioners, and I think every one of us, like whatever we do, research, whether we are researchers or policymakers or whatever hats we wear, it's important to be aware of how spiritual and religious beliefs impact on perpetrators' attitudes and behaviors and on survivors' vulnerability to violence, resilience, and well-being. And also, we should be aware of our own beliefs and biases that shape how we interpret the influences of religion. And we need to also reflect on how we provide support to survivors who hold diverse cultural, spiritual, and religious beliefs. Do we do it the same for all survivors, or do we perhaps take special measures for different groups? Yep, so it's good to reflect on that and take actions, whether these are equitable approaches that promote social justice and people-centered interventions. Next, it's important to demonstrate religious literacy, of course, exploring the religious, cultural, and spiritual factors that are unique to each survivor's circumstances and different groups that we engage with. And it's important to seek opportunities to tailor services for survivors' holistic needs, developing safe referral pathways to verified providers of pastoral and spiritual care, and also informing survivors that they can request support from female faith leaders. So it's important to reach out to those female faith leaders and perhaps train them to be able to help survivors. And finally, what I already said, train faith actors and those responsible for places of worship to provide survivor-centered support with referral to specialist services when needed. So these are just, a bunch of key recommendations for practitioners. As you probably already hear, this guidance note is targeting practitioners. In terms of final recommendations to humanitarian agencies, before I finish, these are several key points that were developed together with participants of consultation workshops last year. And here very quickly, this is not an exhaustive list, there are more on page 30. I invite you to open it. So number one, among key recommendations is to strengthen faith literacy among humanitarian actors to effectively promote faith-sensitive prevention and response to violence against women, yet building on faith community-based resilience and reducing vulnerabilities. Okay, second is to recognize and leverage the role of religious resources, faith leaders, and faith-based organizations to mobilize support for displaced survivors and strengthen protection. So each faith tradition carries a number of religious resources. Some of them might be overlapping, might be unique for each tradition. So it's important to actually tap into those resources to be able to direct them to support survivors, to prevent violence, so work with perpetrators, and so on. Number three, understand the diverse spectrum of belief systems within faith communities, including syncretic practices and ancestral traditions and their impact on positive and negative coping mechanisms with violence against women and girls. So yeah, recognizing the diversity of religious belief and the spectrum of different faith perspectives and being able to engage with people of different beliefs, wherever they are. Number four is to allocate resources for organizations that develop transformative theological materials. So there is lots of good work happening by many faith-based groups that develop theological approaches or scriptural approaches to preventing violence or responding to violence against women and girls. But it's important to enable them to work on this development of these resources. So supporting their work and allocating resources in a way that can help them develop them and perhaps help them to use intersectional feminist lens or any other lens that promotes social justice. And finally, it's to integrate faith-sensitive approaches into mental health and psychosocial support. And many more, well, not so many, maybe 5 more on page 30 if you like to see. So I think these are quite exhaustive recommendations and it will take us time to digest them all. But I haven't finished yet. Last but not least, the note includes 3 practical tools in annexes for use in the field. So I thought I will never produce a guidance note without something that could be taken to the field as a tool. And there are 3 tools that I well, discussed with some survivors, but I never had a chance to test them in interventions, and I welcome and invite any volunteers to test them and help develop them further. So number 2 is an integrated intersectional and socioecological analysis, which basically provides a list of guiding questions for identifying vulnerabilities, intersectional vulnerabilities, including religion and multidimensional resilience. So just a set of guiding questions. And then the second resource is called Faith-Sensitive Gender Analysis. So I adapt Moser's framework or gender framework to identify gender roles, gender access to resources and control over them, and gender practical and strategic needs, including from faith-sensitive perspective, meaning this kind of analysis include attention to religious factors. So I would be happy for you to have a look at that and let me know what you think of it and whether it is something that you could test and try if it works and help us develop it further. And the third resource is called Integrating Faith Sensitivity into GBV Minimum Standards. So the humanitarian sector, a protection cluster, has developed GBV minimum standards a few years ago, and I have taken some time to help bring faith angle to those minimum standards. So there is just a 2-page table that helps do so. And well, if you are a practitioner in the field, if you could have a look at it, that would be wonderful, and tell me what you think of it. So, yep, wrapping up and the next steps before we go to Romina for her response to it. As I mentioned, would very much welcome to further test and develop this guidance note, as this is a living document. I hope to reach to a wide range of users to support the capacity to work on violence against women and girls, and MHVSS, which is cross-cutting with faith sensitivity. And then I invite organizational reviews and contributions to this and testing the resources. So I will end here. Thank you for your attention and for kindly listening to me for almost 25 minutes. I hope that wasn't so painful. Over to Jennifer or straight to Romina.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. That was really insightful. And yeah, I think we'll just hand over to Romina for her response.
Yep. Can you hear me well? There's no breaking of. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Sandra. That was very insightful and I think a really good overview. So for those who joined a bit late, just to say I'm based at SOAS University of London, and for the past 13 years, I'm sort of grounded in gender and development, and my whole work has revolved around decolonizing and desecularizing international development, but especially gender and development responses, including responses to gender-based violence, domestic violence in particular, that I specialize in. So I'm going to offer comments based on my experience in those sectors, and especially in how the same topics are being addressed within gender, religious studies, international development. But I think a lot of these also apply to the humanitarian sector. Again, there's a very close relationship, and Sandra, you can kind of reply back to that between the humanitarian sector and the international development sector. I certainly think that both have been very dismissive of religion. So what I want to start with, just to position this guidance in the genealogy of thought around religion within these sectors first, and then offer a few comments on the guidance and some caution points for people who want to use the guidance. It's first and foremost, it's an excellent piece of work, Sandra. It's much needed. There certainly needs to be something more practice-oriented. I think there's a lot of academic scholarship, as you noted, but there's definitely a need for something that can be employed, more practically within the field on the ground by humanitarian actors. So I think this is a step in the right direction, and kudos to you for doing that. It's not easy. And so I'll jump very quickly to then kind of positioning this guidance the way I see it. And for those who haven't been in that discourse and sector and the conversation around religion and development, and as an extension of the humanitarian sector, the religion traditionally had been ignored and dismissed. There has been what we oftentimes referred to as a turn to religion in the early 2000s, with the World Bank and other international organizations encouraging practitioners to engage with religious leaders and, oftentimes employ their support in development, priorities, in furthering development priorities. But unfortunately, that has translated into tendencies to instrumentalize religious leaders oftentimes. But also there has been a tendency when it comes to gender responses in particular in gender-based violence literature and interventions, there has been a tendency to consider religion as the cause of the problem, as Sandra was saying. Oftentimes, when reactions are raised by religious parties or groups or communities, they're very easily labeled as fundamentalist without really looking at the context. Is it perhaps a differential of worldview? Is it because there are different values and systems and standards that are not being considered in the development practice? So there has been this very essentializing tendency, again, a very dismissive tendency. And despite the effort to engage religious leaders in recent decades, I would argue, again, based on what I've seen in my scholarship and practice on the ground, that this engagement doesn't really involve religious worldviews. And I think Sandra is really going there. We need to see religious systems as worldviews, as part of people's larger worldviews and cosmologies and value systems. It's not a parameter or a dimension that you can just take out because it influences everything else. It's very interconnected. And so by default, there are some negative and some positive implications, but there can also be neutral implications, and these have to be explored. They cannot be assumed. So I think in recent years, again, there has been this direction in moving to engage more with faith and nuance our analytical frameworks around religion and the role of religion in gender relations, in domestic violence, in gender-based violence, and so on. And I think, again, this guidance is both a symptom and a step in that direction, right? There is a paradigm shifting, I think. And I think more people like Sandra and myself, I am a religious individual, are bringing that religious lens into the analysis of gender issues, which has been generally neglected because a lot of the experts that were central in the paradigm making, at least historically, were oftentimes secular-minded, oftentimes based in Western societies that had secularized. So again, they couldn't relate to this dimension of life the way a religious individual might relate. So I just to position a little bit, the guidance, the way I see it, in this movement. And I also think that it very much aligns with an effort that, again, I've been personally involved with, is a decolonization movement, or what in international development and humanitarian interventions might be referred to as, well, partially as localization. Again, looking at the context, understanding people's own concepts, own belief systems, value systems, own definitions, whether it is gender-based violence, whether it is resilience, whatever the concept that we're looking at, to really engage with communities and understand how they understand and how they interpret these phenomena and concepts. So again, I think this is all going in the right direction. I think, Sandra, you haven't used decolonization as a framework, and I also appreciate that because it's oftentimes used as a buzzword. But I do see an alignment, again, with that movement to really nuance and to really engage with communities and honor and respect communities' own worldviews holistically, without us deciding as outsiders what parameter is useful and what parameter is not useful to international development. So in that sense, it's all about diversifying international development and humanitarian responses. The other things I want to say very briefly, apologies if taking a bit more time. I want to make some comments, some caution comments for someone who is going to use this guidance. The first point is around religious literacy. So Sandra does refer that religious literacy involves being open to the role of religious beliefs, practices, and organizations in survivors' and perpetrators' understandings of VAOG and how we respond. And that's absolutely true. Again, I wanted to caution a little bit this concept, because oftentimes, so religious literacy is not a concept that has been systematically defined in the literature. There isn't much academic, robust theorization around what this concept means. So I think this is a gap that any one of you might want to pick up in the future. But we have to be cautious not to identify religious awareness and sensitivity with achieving religious literacy, because it really is, it's a spectrum. And I think the right-hand side, so we are all aiming towards religious literacy, but that's something that we need to work towards achieving. Is not necessarily taken for granted. It's not easy to achieve. And again, I'm saying this as someone who has worked to develop theological materials with clergy in Ethiopia, of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition for many years, where again, I myself, having that theological background, I wouldn't consider and I wouldn't define myself as religiously literate in that context. So I think we need to be very humble. Yes, we need to move towards that, but we need to be, we shouldn't consider that just because we're being aware of people's religious beliefs as humanitarian actors, suddenly we are experts, right? Suddenly we know what we're doing. So I think maintaining that humility, which again comes out from this guidance, I think Sandra does convey that. We need to remain humble and reflexive. And the other thing is, again, humanitarian actors are not, as someone, again, who has created a project Dildil that Sandra mentioned, which means bridge in Tigrinya, one of the spoken languages in our contexts. And our project has tried to essentially be the mediator between development actors, or you might want, by extension, humanitarian actors and local communities, and in particular, faith communities. And what we do, we have those long-term, lifelong relationships with religious institutions, with the clergy. We have that theological, cultural, and linguistic knowledge. So we speak the languages, the theological terminology, the exegetical tradition, and we are able to help build bridges between secular actors or actors who are not versed in religious traditions and the realities of the faith communities we engage with the communities themselves, so that the responses that are being built are appropriate to that context and consider not only what is available, so the religious worldview and the resources and the role of the faith, of the clergy in the community, but also the resources that have been built and exist already. Because as Sandra said, a lot of religious communities have developed resources to respond to gender inequalities, to violence. Maybe they're not as organized or as systematic, but they do exist oftentimes. And again, one should not identify the leadership with clergy, individual clergy on the ground, because one has to consider heterogeneity, right? Not everyone, people do not behave in the same way collectively. So again, one has to really understand the context, and I think the guidance is helping in that. Is kind of giving us some tools to move in that direction. Lastly, I think, as Sandra said, I want to stress the importance of awareness and positionality. So I think when we use this guidance and we think about how we become more religious sensitive, more aware, and more engaging with faith communities, we also need to consider about our positionality. What is our identity? What kind of trust do we have with the community or not? What kind of groundwork do we have to do in order to build that trust? And again, humanitarian actors in particular oftentimes come into a community and in a society in a very short period of time. They don't have the capacity to build those relationships of trust. So they might actually be limited in how well they can, or productively they can engage with these religious or faith-based actors, because first they would need to understand who they are, to map again. So it's important to be very reflexive, one, and secondly, to consider what kind of biases might there be that perhaps hinder productive collaboration with these particular groups. And again, this is not to say that faith actors always have a positive role to play. They might actually influence, as Sandra said, local realities in negative ways as well. But it's about understanding how does who we are and our position in this society help us or not help us build productive collaborations and help faith actors to respond better to these problems, if that makes sense. So really thinking about our positionality. And just not to essentialize religion. Again, I would prefer, I like to speak of religious worldviews because again, religion is a 19th century concept that was created and developed within secular academic thought within Western societies. And what religion tends to, so the connotations that the word has within Western epistemology doesn't necessarily capture how people understand faith or religious worldviews in other contexts. Again, I think the guidance is very reflexive of all these issues, but I only emphasize that whoever wants to use these guidance to try and use it in a way that is reflexive, humble, and avoids essentialization and generalizations. Not to move away from the checklist approach that I have seen in gender and development, and really use it as a resource to help educate ourselves and understand how we can become more productive in our collaborations with communities. And I'll stop here. Sorry, Sandra, for speaking more, but it's an excellent effort, really. Well done.
Thank you, Romina. Well, you just reminded me that this guidance note is for adaptation. It's not for just read and take. It's about, yes, adjusting it to your position and your context and all that. Okay, over to Jennifer. I think we have questions on people. Hands up there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Romina, first of all, for your response, and Sandra, of course, as well. So if you heard Sandra's presentation and you thought it was good, then Romina came in and you got another really, really excellent perspective that she shared with us here. We do have around 15 minutes now left for questions to Sandra or comments. Maybe people want to share from their experience. I would suggest that we take, I see 2 hands up, so I would suggest we take Mohammed's question or comment and then Stephen's, and then we go back to Sandra. That should leave us enough time then to finish at the full hour. Yes, of course, and as Sandra has mentioned in the chat, you are also more than welcome to just put your questions in the chat. And apologies, I'll keep my camera off for the remainder of the meeting because my internet connection is a bit bumpy. Yeah, so Mohammed, would you like to share your question or your comment?
Yes. Hello, hello, Sandra. Thank you very much for presentation, and thank you, Dr. Romina, for response. And actually, I have 2 news. I mean, one is good and one is bad. So I will start with the good. So I'm very proud, Sandra, how far you have achieved since we start our joint projects a few years ago. And mashallah, you are doing a very great job. And I think this is a very needed a guideline, actually. And definitely we will benefit from it and use it. And maybe we will volunteer to translate it into Arabic, maybe. So it's not to promise, but we will try, actually, because it is like very needed in our context. That was the good news. Now, the bad news is I want to express some ideas that resonate with what Dr. Romina has said. First, decolonization. When we talk about decolonization, and I think it's like a problem when decolonization comes from universities who are located in colonizing countries. So how come? I mean, if you are enjoying the heritage of colonization, resources, expertise, and then you want to work in decolonization, you need to reconsider this. I think the leadership of decolonization should come from our countries who was colonized, actually. So this is first. Second, you still working under the paradigm of this colonization, and which talk about like secularism and faith. This is definition of secularism, because according to faith worldview, there's the faith and the faith. Like secularism is a faith according to faith people. This needs to be recognized. So what is seen is secularism is trying to impose their faith, their ideology into the humanitarian work. And one example is the theory of gender itself. The theory of gender is not accepted by faith people. We have a different view of how we can approach this, like woman violence against women, for example. So we need to talk about the definition or the use of gender in itself. Second thing, actually, is you cannot talk without taking into consideration what is happening now. Like in Gaza now, 2% of people have been killed. If we say half of them are women, then we can say that violence, which is non-gender based against women, has caused death more than all gender-based violence around the world. This needs to be talked about. Why to focus on gender-based violence where we have non-gender-based violence all around? So this is another way that maybe faith people will look at it. So for me, it is an advanced step and it is beneficial, but I think if the dominating paradigm and establishment of humanitarian work don't do serious reform in what they are doing, so you need to expect that there's a revolution is coming. And like, for example, in Iraq now, there is a decision by the government. It prohibits use of gender words in any document. And there's a problem there, actually. I don't know if you heard about it. So maybe revolution will come. So this is like a message that we need to rethink how we can actually do a reform that is necessary before something we cannot control comes. Again, thank you very much, Sandra. I'm proud of you. And I will look into the guideline and I will use it in my work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for that comment and question, I suppose, as well for Sandra. Let's hand over to Stephen for his question or comment, and then go back to Sandra so that she can reply to both of them.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sandra, I'm at a very, very boring UN conference right now, so I'm not going to turn my camera on and have had the opportunity while they're blabbing away to like read your paper and listen to this. So it's absolutely fantastic. First, just a point. I just completed a project on the future of FORB, Freedom of Religion and Belief for Stephanos Alliance. And in the midst of this, we were finding all these things related to gender-based violence and so forth. So there's an intersectionality as well with just the freedom of religion or belief and finding a strong gender component and so forth. So I thought that was intriguing that it was not directly related to the research I was doing, but it was invariably popping up. But my question for you, and I've read through your guidance notes and you're talking about trauma, and this is kind of the area that I work in. And so I'm curious, we probably should just have a separate conversation because you're referencing it in really powerful ways. I'm curious what level of trauma awareness, trauma-informed approach, trauma literacy, for lack of a better term. I think this term, again, is getting overused, but it's a powerful, powerful mental factor that really enables you to either thrive or it shuts you down. And no matter how many interventions are involved, if there's not that community-led healing and that trauma transformative sort of approaches, a lot of what we do in this sort of space is just, you know, water off a duck's back and so forth. So do you see that there's actually a really, and granted, this probably wasn't part of your work, but are you seeing that there's still unexplored territory between religion and trauma and the psychosocial support that is needed in space would be my question.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll go back first to the recent question from Stephen. Thanks for that. And then I'm going to comment on Mohammed's commentary. Well, yes, religion obviously impacts on people's well-being in positive and negative ways. And there's, well, based on what I've been doing in my studies, there was not sufficient evidence in forced displacement humanitarian settings. There's lots of evidence on that, how religion may contribute to trauma in Western developed, whatever global North context, but less on Southern contexts in fragile settings. So I think we still need to understand it. And there's so much different inquiries that could be posed to extend knowledge base in this field. Well, I've been looking just very superficially really at this intersection of trauma and religion. It came out in several interviews with survivors who would talk about spiritual struggles and how this doesn't enable them to move on with their lives. And then some people would speak that they talked to religious leaders and they found some responses to their spiritual struggles, like being unclean or not being able to remarry after sexual exploitation. So once they heard from religious leaders, a religious leader advised that they can remarry, that they are clean, that they are dignified, that God will forgive, well, doesn't need to forgive them because it was not their fault, like stuff like that, and give them prayers to mention, they would go on, they would be enabled to move on with their lives. They would be somehow equipped to move, to perhaps resolve some of the traumas. But I think we need to have more mental health studies in these areas. My study was sociological study, was not health oriented, so I cannot really comment deeper than that now. But I'm very interested in this angle, and it would be really nice to talk to you outside of this as well. Going to Mohammed's question, well, obviously everything that we do will be part of some structures, and we may say everything is colonized and we should be just decolonize. We should be taking a lens of decolonization, and best positioned people to do that are in the post-colonial contexts. That's right, but it doesn't mean that people who are based in Northern Hemisphere wouldn't be enabled to do this kind of work if they wish so, if they feel that they can make a contribution. I think that's what I felt like. I felt like I can do a contribution in this field and bring some new perspective based on my positionality and networks and knowledge that I can convey. So I know Romina might be better positioned to respond to your question on decolonization, colonization. I just wanted to highlight that there's a very narrow line between obviously secular and faith. I know these are concepts that are used by perhaps, as you said, secular contexts. Secularity is a faith on its own, perhaps ideology, that's fine. But I wish that our studies, whatever we do, will be sharing knowledge, power sharing knowledge, that we'll be able to work in partnerships so we can advance certain research inquiries and share resources to do more productive work. But I wouldn't exclude practitioners and academics from the Northern Hemisphere as not equipped to do so, because I feel like there are very narrow lines between geographical areas in the era of globalization. So I think there are similarities and overlaps between different approaches to gender. And I agree with you, there are needs to develop very contextualized understandings of gender, approaches to development, to humanitarian work, to development, all this. I feel like different settings, different actors will develop they would have their own take on it, but I wouldn't undervalue the shared values and the shared points of connection that bring us together. And I wouldn't think that everything would be just excluding itself. Yeah. I don't know if Romina wants to come in on decolonization, working on that from a Western university, because that's what you might be thinking you've been doing. So yes, here you go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity, Sandra. This is your day. I thank you, Mohammed. I mean, I think I fully agree with you. So I want to say I'm Eastern European, born in Moldova. And the reason I started this work was because my own country was misrepresented and generalized in international development as the poorest country of Europe. And so for me, decolonization is very much understood on the basis of my own positionality, which is epistemological, cognitive decolonization of the mind, that we have reinforced ourselves because we don't reflect on these inherited standards and knowledge and values that we've, again, have inherited due to modern decoloniality, as decolonial theorists in Latin America have theorized it. So again, I would answer to you that you're right when it comes to decolonizing the systems within, let's say in Ethiopia, it should be Ethiopia-led. I fully agree. I still think that there is value in knowledge exchange because, in our context, I'm based now at a Western institution. Decolonization has become a mainstream concern because we are responding to our own problems, the problems of top-down approaches in research and international development. So we're trying to address a problem that is a problem to us in the Western context, right? So why are we bringing this problem, or why are we introducing this to an African context, pretending that sort of we came up it's our solution to a problem that we created in the first place, if that makes sense. But I think there is, we just need to understand that there are different priorities here and there are different priorities there. In Ethiopia, where I work, for instance, the term is not used at all. Ethiopia considers itself one of the few countries that were never colonized, is very proud about this history. And yet when I share with my colleagues what I want to do, which is to diversify knowledge, to honor the knowledge that they've inherited from their forefathers and foremothers, and not see it as inferior to Western knowledge. They relate to that very much, right? So I think it's about understanding the strengths and the limitations of our positionalities and identities and locations in the world, and working around that. Because as Sandra said, if we put our hands up and say, well, decolonization is not our problem, but we've created our problem to a large extent. So we also have to be part of the solution, if that makes sense, Muhammad. So I think it's about collaboration that is humble and genuine. I think that's the only solution forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Romina. Mohammed, I'm so sorry, but time is up. We have to finish. But I'm sure Sandra would be happy to, and Romina as well, would be happy to continue the conversation. Right? You'll find the email, I mean, Sandra's email address you have anyway. Romina contact details you'll find online as well. So I would just like to thank everyone again for coming today. Of course, first and foremost, Sandra for choosing our reading group to launch the guidance note, Romina for taking the time to join us, to offer her comments, and everyone else who also, made it today. From experience, a lot more people than attend today are going to watch the recording of the session online. So thank you to everyone who catches up on the recording later as well. And we look forward to continuing to see Sandra doing exciting work. I'm sure there will be more publications and toolkits out soon. And I'll
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Well done, Sandra. Bye. Thank you. Bye, Jennifer.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Good to see
Bye.
you.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Jeremy.